One key theme in H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Call of Cthulhu, is the receptivity that certain human beings possess, by contrast to their fellow human beings, to the thoughts of the great old ones, which are how they communicate and indeed how they shape humanity in a certain way, or at least the actions and responses of certain human beings. And part of this takes place through the cult, which we've talked about elsewhere. Now we want to focus on the artist and poet types that Lovecraft would probably include himself within. And the first document, which is of vital importance, is discussed in the first part, the Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox. This is a document that has been left behind by the narrator's great uncle, Professor Angell, in this box, along with several other documents. And as things go, it emerges out of a consultation that this Wilcox character has with Professor Angell, because he has created a bas-relief, a small one that's also in the box, which depicts this being Cthulhu, as well as the hints of a city behind him and a bunch of writing which he's being consulted about, the professor, because the artist has no idea what this writing means. As it turns out, neither does the professor. So what do we know about this character? His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox. My uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family, slightly known to him, who had latterly been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design and living alone at the Fleur-de-Lis building near that institution. Okay, so he's an art student, and he's from a good family. What else? Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius, but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. And we're going to get a very interesting contrast here in his own self-description and the description others have of him. He says that he is psychically hypersensitive, which turns out to be the case. But he is dismissed by other people as merely being queer. Now, we should point out, since some of these terms have changed meanings in the, close to 100 years since the both narration and the publication of this story, that queer here just means odd, off. It doesn't have anything to do at this point with sexuality, but who knows? That could figure into it as well. So the staid folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him, and he dropped gradually from social visibility and now was known only to a small group of aesthetes from other town. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. So we got an isolated artist character, and that's interesting, but we're not here for a character sketch. What's the upshot? He has dreams. This bas-relief has come out of these dreams. So he recalls that, and this is part of what the professor is going to write down. So he says, here we go, a rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There'd been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years. Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Now, as we're going to find out in the narrative, yes, the earthquake tremor played a role in this, but not quite so directly. He goes on and says he'd had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars. So we've got a cityscape going on, and it's a cityscape that is off in certain respects. And then we get a voice that is not a voice saying what? A chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sounds. but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters Cthulhu Ftang, however that's supposed to be pronounced. And so Professor Angell is questioning him and begins, we could say, a process of asking this young man about his dreams. And this bore regular fruit. After the first interview, the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of the nocturnal imagery, whose burden was always some, again that word, terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone, with a subterrene voice or intelligence shouting monotonously in enigmatic sense and impacts, inscribable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and relay. So we're getting a consistent dream going on the part of this young man, and then he has a medical episode. We find out Wilcox failed to appear. The professor goes and looks for him. He's been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He had cried out aloud in the night and manifested since then only alternations of unconsciousness and delirium. And so the uncle phones the family, talks to Dr. Toby, who's in charge. The young person's febrile mind was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not only a repetition of what he'd formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on a gigantic thing, miles high, which walked or lumbered about. He had no time fully describe this object, but occasional frantic words convinced the professor it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. So this is going to pass very quickly, and the young man will come out of this state and no longer have, let's call them, interesting dreams of these sorts. But he's seen Cthulhu himself, right? So this is an important part. And then Angell is going to engage in some inquiries. What are everybody else dreaming? And he finds out that average people in society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result, though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd. Scientific men, a second class, were little more affected, though 4 cases of vague description suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes, and in one case there's mentioned a dread of something abnormal. So, most people, whether scientific or not greatly affected by what's happening. They're not having dreams that are anything more than little hints. What about the poets and the artists? People who are imaginative, people who are receptive to influences. He says, it was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. Why? Because they're all dreaming the same things, the same horrible things, the same terror-inspiring things. So they have bizarre and consistent dreams. He says the intensity of the dreams was immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half-sounds not unlike those which Wilcox had described. Some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of the gigantic, nameless thing visible toward the last, and we even get one person who goes insane, has to be put in an asylum, and expires after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. We also get press clippings which seem to confirm this. We're not sure whether they're just sensitive people or cult members, but it's happening all over the world. Now, later in part 2, the narrator goes to interview Wilcox. And why does he do this? Because he suspects that maybe Wilcox knew of the Cthulhu cult in some way and made the sculpture and went to his uncle to, try to get over on him somehow. He says he invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. But as it's going to turn out, that's not the case. So he meets up with Wilcox. And interestingly, he says that if he lives longer, will be heard from sometime as one of the great decadents. He is crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur Machen evokes in prose and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and in painting. Now, these are real people. These are authors, artists that H.P. Lovecraft has, engaged with, read, and praises. So he's introducing some real people in the story by way of comparison to who Wilcox is and the sensitivity that he has. So he goes on and he says, I tried with subtlety to draw him out. In a short time I became convinced of his absolute sincerity, for he spoke of the dreams in a manner none could mistake. They and their subconscious residuum had influenced his art profoundly, and he showed me a morbid statue whose contours almost make me shake with the potency of its black suggestion, right? That he really knew nothing of the hidden cult, save from what my uncle's relentless catechism had let fall, he soon made clear. And again, I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. And he tells about his dreams there. The narrator does, however, still doubt him a little bit. He says, Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way and soon forgotten it amidst the mass of his equally weird reading and imagining. Later, by virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams, in the bas-relief and in the terrible statue I now beheld. So his imposture upon my uncle had been a very innocent one. Is that really the case? Well, what Castro has had to say, which the narrator by this point knows because he's read the report of Inspector Legras, suggests otherwise. What does Castro, who is part of the cult and has spoken with ancient leaders of the cult in the mountains of China, have to say? Well, the great old ones, as he says, speak to human beings, but speak to who? The sensitive among them by molding their dreams. Only thus could their language of thought, reach the fleshly minds of mammals. So this has been going on for a long time, but why was the earthquake important? Well, because the city of Relay, where these great old ones lie entombed, communicating to human beings, sunk underneath the sea. And the ocean waters provide a kind of damper or buffer. They prevent this spectral intercourse, as he calls it. And when the city rises because of the earthquake, or maybe the earthquake is caused by the rise of it, the stars seemingly being right, then this communication can resume again. And so the sensitive among human beings, like H.A. Wilcox, the poets and the artists, can receive these signals from the minds of the entombed great old ones, and specifically from and of Cthulhu. So that's what's actually happening here. And it's very interesting because we get a look into the minds of the imaginative and sensitive, the receptive human beings that can actually give us an idea of what is going on in this narrative. And so this is a really central part. And the last thing that I'll say is that H.P. Lovecraft, where would he fit in with this? Well, he is a poet of sorts, an artist of sorts, somebody who sees kindred spirits in these decadents, and presumably he would be one of those who would have been affected. Of course, he is outside of the narrative, though perhaps narrating it as the narrator himself.